The sun had just barely set when I started my first night at South Pittsburg Hospital on the night shift. The hospital is located in South Pittsburg, which is in southeastern Tennessee, and had been a pillar of the community since the 1950s. I'd done my clinical lab training there, and I enjoyed working at the hospital on day shift. I'd heard the stories, of course, ghost stories that the nurses swapped back and forth in hushed tones over hurried lunches, but I never really put any stock in them. I believed everything could be explained. That night, as the hospital corridors dimmed, the solitude enveloped me. I was sorting through patient samples when I heard a soft wailing sound. I didn't know what it was at first, so I left the lab and went across the hall to see what the sound was. As I got closer, the sound grew louder, and it was unmistakably the sound of babies crying. I couldn't understand this. My rational mind was grappling with the noise emanating from the abandoned nursery. It gave me a chill, but shaking off the chill, I went back to my work and just forced myself to think about what I was doing. I attributed the sounds to the wind, maybe a faulty fan or just my imagination. That night was less about settling in and more about unsettling discoveries. Midway through my shift, I stepped out in the hall. They had told me to be on the lookout for a new employee that was going to come in and train early in the morning. As I walked past the waiting area, I saw a young man sitting on a couch. He had on khaki pants, a lab coat, had longer hair, kind of sandy blonde color, and he looked up at me. I said, "Hi, you must be the new guy. Let me set my stuff down and I'll show you around." I turned to set my tray on the counter, and when I turned back, he was gone. I couldn't understand what had happened. I know he had been there, but now, heart pounding, I'm just staring at an empty space where a person had been. That night, the peculiar turned downright bizarre. I would hear papers shuffling and moving across the room. There was a rack of glass syringes on top of the refrigerator that somehow managed in the floor, yet none of the glass syringes were broken. I even heard a growl and couldn't explain where it came from. It was very unnerving. I had to get out of the lab for a little while to go and get some coffee. I walked down to the basement area where the kitchen was. The only coffee I had that night was a vending machine. So as I got me a cup of vending machine coffee, I stood there and waited. As the coffee cup filled, I picked it up and started to leave, but my lab coat had got hung on an object. When I turned around to free it, there was nothing behind me. That made me really unsettled, so I returned back to the lab and finished out my shift. These things wore on me, and then one night in particular, I was a bundle of raw nerves. All these previous experiences had left me tense, and I was expecting shadows to jump to life at every turn. I was working on an analyzer, and I looked up and saw a shadow on the wall beside of my shadow. The shadow was huge. It had to be 7 feet tall. I thought it was a trick of the light, and that it was my shadow because there were many lights in the hospital or in the lab that could have caused me to have this type of shadow. I moved around a little bit to see if the shadow would move, and it didn't. It was still there. Thinking it may have been someone playing a prank on me, I turned around quickly, but no one was behind me. I decided then I needed to get out of the lab again. I had to go draw some patient samples anyway. So I set a timer for the test that I was working on, went out of the lab, and drew patient specimens. When I came back into the lab, as I walked through the door, I could hear the timer going off, so I knew it was time to check my results. I went back to the countertop, and as I was leaning down, looking into the analyzer, I could feel a presence against my shoulder, a light pressure, like someone was leaning on my shoulder, looking over it to see what I was doing. I assumed it was one of my co-workers, one of the pranksters that I work with, Kevin, or one of the other Kevins. And so I swung my arm back and said, "Watch out, Kevin." And there was no one there. But I could still feel that presence. I tried to convince myself that it was all my imagination, but I couldn't. I couldn't make myself believe that it wasn't real. As the dawn approached, though, those oppressive feelings began to dissipate. The shadows receded into the corners of the room as if the light were a shield that could protect me from the darkness. I was left with a feeling of relief, but also an insatiable curiosity about what had happened. Was I losing my mind, or was the hospital truly as haunted as they say? Leaving the hospital that morning, the light seemed to wash away the fears, but relief was superficial. Underneath, the dread lingered, knowing that I would have to come back, a silent acknowledgement that the next time I might not be so lucky. As I walked to my car, the first rays of sunlight creeping over the horizon felt like a protective hand on my shoulder, guiding me away from the night's dark embrace. While I've shared several of my eerie encounters at the haunted hospital, these stories are merely a glimpse into the countless unexplained experiences I've had within its walls. Each visit seemed to peel back another layer of the hospital's mysterious past, revealing more than just echoes of its historical operation. But the shadows of South Pittsburg Hospital would always be waiting, just as they had for countless others.